sometimes when I meet you or one of your team, I can hear this little voice that isn't coming from you saying, "Oh, that's a nice colour you're wearing," or at least it will be in a couple of years' time.
You can imagine, like when I have to select a colour for myself, so we've just recently decorated our bathroom at home and my entire world is interiors, so it's all about forecasting trends for home. So when I make a choice for my home, people say, "Oh, is that going to be the next big thing? Should we be taking notes?" So what starts off as a personal colour choice ends up being under great scrutiny. Just felt like you were on a movie set, because my only experience of having seen New York would have been in films. So it was very much, we got up in the morning, we had breakfast at the hostel, we went and got our litre of coffee or whatever people get, and you walk to work and everybody's walking in the same direction to work, and got in an elevator that took you up 35 floors to your design studio. I read an amazing thing the other day that said you should say to children, "What do you want to be first?"
Yeah.
And I thought that's exactly it, isn't it? That you can have multiple career options, some of them at the same time actually now.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Northern Spotlights with me, Terry McStay. It's really good to see you again. And I'm delighted that today my guest is Joanna Feeley of TrendBible.
My name is Joanna Feeley and I am founder and chief executive at TrendBible.
Now, I must admit, sometimes when I meet you or one of your team, I can hear this little voice that isn't coming from you saying, "Oh, that's a nice colour you're wearing," or at least it will be in a couple of years' time. So do you have family and friends who are always like, "Oh, what colour cushion should we get?"
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine, like when I have to select a colour for myself, so we've just recently decorated our bathroom at home and my entire world is interiors, so it's all about forecasting trends for home. So when I make a choice for my home, people say, "Oh, is that going to be the next big thing? Should we be taking notes?" So what starts off as a personal colour choice ends up being under great scrutiny. But yeah, people always ask.
Do you feel the pressure of, "I've got to get this right because half my family are going to be..."
Try not to. I try and just say to people, like, personal taste accounts for a lot, and my personal taste is shaped just like everybody else's is. You just like certain things at certain times. But yeah, I do get asked that a lot, especially when people are decorating or they've bought a new home or something like that. They know that we will know what the future of home is going to be like in a year or 2 years' time, or if they're fitting a kitchen, they want to have it guaranteed that they're picking a kitchen that is going to add value to their home in 10 years' time. So we get a lot of questions there.
So I mean, I kind of know what you do, but for the benefit of those who have no idea, could you sum it up in a couple of sentences what trend forecasting is? I mean, we'll come on to it in more detail as we go, but just to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, behind every product that gets designed is a design team. So whether you're buying from a brand or a retailer, it could be Sainsbury's, it could be Marks and Spencer's. So every single environment and store that you buy from, there's a design team that have to decide what they want to sell you at that particular time. And every single product that gets made generally takes between 6 months and 5 years to actually produce. So those designers need to know what people will want in the future. And behind the design industry sits the trend forecasting industry, which is what TrendBible is part of. So our job is to give confidence to those designers, help them pick colours and shapes and designs and products that are going to sell and resonate with a future audience, and judge the social mood, make sure that they get it right. Because there's nothing more threatening for a designer than a whole lot of stock that didn't sell and a whole lot of product that had to go into a sale. So it sounds very kind of like a very frivolous activity sometimes, trend forecasting, but when you really nail it down, somebody's job is to make a decision on sometimes millions of pounds worth of product, and they have to get that right.
And this isn't just kind of high-end designer stuff. This could be a cushion you buy in Tesco or Marks's or something like that. But still that kind of, all that thought goes into making it, or deciding it's got that colour or it's got that pattern on it.
Yes, and the more mass market it is, so you could argue that some of the most mass market retailers and brands actually have the biggest reach. They produce the biggest volumes, so therefore the risk is even greater for them. But it's not always linked to interior product as well. So sometimes we get asked to do things like forecast a waterless future for a laundry detergent manufacturer, because they're already thinking about what kind of world we're going to be living in 2, 5, 10 years time. So they would ask us to look at challenges around what happens when water becomes a real luxury at home, in the same way that we've kind of experienced with our electricity and our gas over the last sort of 2 years. How does that make people think about how many times they boil a kettle or how they heat their homes? So sometimes we're getting asked really big questions about what is driving people's life at home. And sometimes people are phoning us and saying, we did really well with this green cushion last year. Should we do another one, or should we change it to something else? So it can be very frivolous, very decor, very design driven, or it can be very broad and lifestyle driven.
Right. And quite talking about water being a luxury. I mean, that's a big subject that most people probably wouldn't think about. So yeah, it's a really broad spectrum. Yeah,
and I think we've done loads of research on this, and if you look at some of the droughts that have happened, particularly in the States on the West Coast over the last few years, when things like that happen, it brings to our collective attention the type of environmental crises that can actually really change the way that you behave at home and the things you use and how you use them. So we might think that we walk into a shop and we just fancy buying a water bottle because we want to sort of, make sure that we're hydrated while we're at work or whatever it might be. But actually, sometimes those subliminal messages around the purchasing that we're doing are being planted from the news that we're reading, from the media we're consuming, and from our impression of the world around us.
Right. So it's not just fashion trends, it's genuinely global, possibly lifestyle changing trends.
Yeah. And in that respect, we don't choose the trends. I think a lot of people think trend forecasters choose the trends, and we tell design teams in retail and brand what to produce. But actually, I always say it's more like holding up a mirror to what's actually happening. Right. It's like holding up a mirror to society to say, this is the way that people feel. This is how there's an attitudinal shift that's making their behaviours shift in some way, and therefore the kind of products they'll be drawn to, or the kind of marketing messaging, the kind of language they might be drawn to will change. So it's no 2 days are the same, as you can imagine.
Because I must admit, when we first met and we first started kind of doing some work together, I did kind of think, yeah, but if you're just saying that this shade of green is going to be big in 2 years' time, well, it will be, because they've listened to you, and it's almost a self-fulfilling. Well, it's not like that at all, is it?
It's not like that, and actually, we get really hard evidence of that as well. So, say for example, if we've advised a client, because we advise companies on what they should do. So sometimes we'll advise a company that then doesn't take our advice,
right? But
actually, you see the rest of the market shift in that direction. So you can gain evidence quite quickly that a trend is happening, or a new attitudinal shift is happening, or a new behaviour is being lived out at home, because the rest of the market picks up on it, even though the customer that you advised didn't sometimes act on that.
Right. And they live to regret it.
Well, sure. I was going to say, we refrain from saying hate to say we told you so, but that's...
You think it, you might not see it. So we've kind of skipped ahead a little bit, which is fine, because I'm sure we're going to get into a bit more detail of how this all works. But as with all our guests, you've very kindly sent us a few photographs just so we can get a better feel for, what led you to where you are now. So that first one there is that a tree house?
It is a tree house.
Wow.
It's a tree house. My dad built that for us.
Right.
And we spent, from the minute that was built, we just spent all our time in there. And actually, you can see it's very triangular. So there came a point very quickly whereby we're too tall to fit in it. But we spent all our time in that tree house. We absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So which one are you on that photo?
I'm the tallest one with the belt on, you will notice. That's kind of why I like this photograph as well, because...
even
then, I was thinking about accessorizing, and
really?
And I can really vividly remember sort of that. It wouldn't have seemed like a sort of contrast to me at the time. It would just have been my life. But living in rural Northumberland, we lived in a converted railway cottage, on a disused railway line. It would have been the Carlisle to Settle railway line.
Right.
So that no longer exists. So that was in our front garden, actually, a bit of the railway track. And we lived in what would have been it was called Railway Cottage.
Right.
And it would have been the waiting room. And it started off as one room, and my dad is a builder and he extended it over a decade. So we lived in, a tiny, tiny hamlet. There were no shops. There was a post office, but it was somebody's front room. And yeah, it was a wonderful sort of carefree childhood in that respect. But I also remember coming back to the sort of the accessorizing in the belt, this kind of, I don't know what it was, but like this desire to be connected into a broader culture that I knew existed. And I think when you live in Northumberland, you grow up hearing all these things about, the cool stuff happens elsewhere. And we'd have people who maybe went to school in London that would maybe move up to the northeast, and you'd think, oh yeah, they're wearing different things too.
That would just seem like a different planet.
Totally, yeah. So I was very sort of thirsty for that culture. And I can remember being very young and wanting to buy magazines. And, when things like the clothes show came on TV, that was a massive influence for me. When I saw stuff like that, I knew that's the kind of world that I wanted to be involved in, even though I was clearly in my treehouse wearing wellies with my bowl cut and my belt on.
Because I suppose you can understand that if you grew up in Milan or somewhere where you're surrounded by those things, but you kind of created that world almost out of nothing.
And I don't know where it came from. I mean, my mum she always liked to decorate the house, and she would always be getting things like wallpaper samples and things like that. So my dad would build the house and she would have an eye for being able to sort of pull colour palettes together and decorate. Right. So I remember very early on having her Laura Ashley catalogue, and when she was done with that, I used to wait months for this to expire, and I would cut out the samples of the fabrics and the wallpapers and make them into little outfits and little room sets and things like that. So I loved craft. I was always cutting and sticking and colouring in and very creative. So that was like just part of my character from day one. I remember doing that from being tiny. There was nobody that ever said, do you want to paint and draw? It was just something I did all the time. Right.
So you're always going to be working in this field?
Yeah. I mean, if you spoke to my dad now, he'd probably say I'm just doing a modern day grown up version of cutting stuff.
You're still just playing with cutting out and...
Yeah, I think that's right.
So it sounds like you had a really quite idyllic almost childhood out in the wilds, tree houses, Yeah, I mean, probably I always felt like we were sort of, as I say, like missing things, like that it was a sort of, it felt a bit cut off for me. But when I look back at it now, I mean, children don't really get the opportunity to have that sort of lifestyle nowadays. And my children are being brought up in the city centre, and they can walk everywhere. They've got access to mobile phone technology, so it's a really, really different childhood. So I feel very lucky to have experienced that, but I'm not sure how many kids get to really live that kind of childhood anymore nowadays. Yeah, I'm not sure how many tree houses there are.
No,
probably not as many as there should be. So did that then lead you to? So even then, so what age would you have been on that?
I think about 8, something like that, 9 maybe.
So even then, you kind of knew. Or did you think, this is the kind of direction I want to go, as opposed to, I really want to be an accountant or a dentist or whatever?
I don't think I was thinking about a career at that point. And I think there was definitely probably a spell a bit later than that where I thought that those things would, anything creative couldn't be a job. It would never have occurred to me that people actually, even though I was watching things like the clothes show and I was starting to, a little bit after that, starting to buy magazines and, Just 17, all these sort of girls magazines, like teen magazines was a massive thing at that time, which again is not really a culture anymore. So I was sort of getting that exposure to that sort of world, but it felt like that was a leisure activity and that you can enjoy magazines and you can watch the clothes show, but it didn't occur to me that there were careers that might unfold from that. And certainly nobody that I knew was doing a job like that. So it wasn't until much, much later that somebody suggested to me that I might want to consider a career in fashion.
And I think that's often the case, isn't it? With those type of creative type careers, younger people appreciate them, but never associate themselves with actually doing that thing, either because they don't realise what goes into it, or it just seems kind of unattainable.
It does, and I think there's loads of careers like that maybe seem quite glamorous in some respects. And of course, behind that idea of I might want to be a fashion designer, which is probably what I ended up thinking a few years after that. There are tons of other careers like a trend forecaster that you just wouldn't know about had you not pursued the initial gloss of wanting to be a fashion designer. So once you start to pull the thread on that inspiration, there's tons more to find out about. But I firmly believe you have to see it to be it. I really believe that. I think, you know, how on earth would I have found that thread and pulled on it had people not put those stepping stones in there for me to figure out that it was a legitimate career option and you could study fashion design. It just blew my mind that was real.
Really?
Yeah.
So why was that something you thought was so amazing when you found that out? Because
like you said, you know, I didn't ever think, oh, I'll be an accountant, partly because I was terrible at maths. But my dad could sort of recognise that I was creative, and he used to say things to me like, well, if you want to do something artistic and creative, you're going to have to learn to be like a sign writer or something like that. He was thinking more in the traditional sense of the application of creative skills. And so I was starting to be interested in things like graphic design, but I, again, didn't really know where that could take me. Yeah. And I was already starting to think bigger than rural Northumberland. Yeah. You know, I kind of was starting to think about, I'd like to go to London. I'd never even been to London at that point. The first time I ever went to London was actually for my interview at Kingston University. Really? Yeah. So there was definitely that desire there to go to different places and to start to spread my wings a little bit. Whereas I think my parents were probably thinking, well, you probably can't do those jobs in Northumberland. And that wasn't even on my radar. Yeah. I remember at 16 ordering a university prospectus for one of the universities in California. And it just came through the door. Wow. My parents were like, oh, we weren't really expecting this. Where are you getting all these ideas from? So I had the ideas. It took a while to piece it together in terms of a route, but other people helped me with that. Yeah. I mean, I had an A-level teacher who only taught me really for quite a short time, maybe a term. And she could see that the work that I was doing in my graphic design A-level lended itself really well to fashion design. And she said, why don't you tailor one of your projects less to graphics and more to fashion? Right. I said, am I allowed to do that? You know, is that a real thing? So she was the first person that planted a seed that, yes, it's okay that fashion is a sort of legitimate career option. Yeah. It's a topic. It's not just a leisure activity that you can consume. It's something you can participate in. Yeah. And actually make a living at doing. Yes, yeah. And from there, I knew that somebody had pointed out to me that I could go to Newcastle College to do an art foundation course there. Right. And that actually happened to be the lady who ran the local art supply shop. So she'd said to me, oh, you seem to be in here a lot, buying lots of sketchbooks and filling them up very quickly. What is it that you're interested in? And I said, I'm doing this fashion project. And she said, oh, you can study that if you go to Newcastle College. Right. And so I looked into it and applied there. So people did breadcrumb that trail for me. Without those chance conversations. Yeah. And I think for a lot of young people, maybe not now, but when I was growing up, you were really limited to what the people around you thought was possible. Yes. And if their view was quite limited, then you had that limited view yourself. Yeah. Apart from those exceptional people who just pushed through it all. But I do wonder how many people there are who are doing jobs that, they're okay, but actually they had the talent or the skill to do something incredible. They just didn't have those chance encounters with the right person to direct them. I mean, I can see myself doing that with my 15-year-old son. You know, I mean, he's doing things like drop shipping, you know, online and doing all these amazing things. And I can see myself going, oh, I don't know anything about this world. How could you possibly make money or make a career out of doing that? And actually he's teaching me, this is what my world looks like. Yeah. In the same way that I was probably saying to my parents, you know, I want to be a fashion designer and study fashion. So it's really interesting now being on the other side of that and being, you know, there's a whole extra shift that's happened now with digital technology. Yeah. Well, one of the other guests, Ian Farrar, he was talking about his son who's 20, who was a barber for a couple of years. And he's done that now. He's moved on to something else. So he's had one career and he's still 20, but that's normal. It is. And I read an amazing thing the other day that said you should say to children, what do you want to be first? Yeah. And I thought that's exactly it, isn't it? That you can have multiple career options, some of them at the same time actually now. but what do you want to be first?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very sensible way to approach a modern career, because
And it takes the pressure off as well, doesn't it?
yeah, it does.
Not what do you want to be for the rest of your life,
Yes.
but what do you want to have a go at and see where it leads?
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. So in terms, so this was what, 16, 17ish, where things started becoming a bit clearer?
Yes. Yeah. And we're talking sort of like 90s. I mean, the 90s I know has been glamorized. It's come around again, Terry. You might not be surprised to hear.
Well, I've still got all my 90s gear in the wardrobe in the hope that it becomes...
It's back. Get it all ready.
Right, okay.
So, yeah, the 90s culturally, I mean, I can just, I've got crystal clear memories of, I remember all the supermodels and the George Michael videos, and that was when all the sort of fashion TV started to come through, and MTV was created. So there was an explosion in sort of teen pop culture at that time,
right.
Which completely coincided with me. I went to university in '95 to study fashion, so there was a ton of exciting stuff. There was a whole Britpop scene happening then, so there was a big focus on British culture, and being British was something people were very proud of. So I just remember that time being a very sort of culturally rich environment, and perfect for me wanting to go to London and start out my career as a fashion designer.
So that's where you did a degree in fashion?
Did a degree in fashion at Kingston University, in Surrey.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was your first impression of London when you got there?
Oh, I don't think I can even put it into words. I mean, I was laughing about this with my mum the other day, because I think that my experience of a city was Newcastle, which is, pretty much walkable from one end to the other in 30 minutes or something like that. And I thought London would just be a slightly bigger version of that. So there were definitely times when I set off, for a walk into London down the A3. I mean, I was very green, very, very naive, and hadn't lived a lot of life before I went to university. But that first year of university, I grew up very quickly and just had to get very street smart. And it was a big culture shock between, living in a very sort of safe environment where you know everybody, to suddenly being thrown into this really big place with all these other students who wanted to study fashion. But Kingston, it probably still is. I think it was like the second or third best fashion school in the country. And so I was in a class with, the cream of the crop of British fashion talent, who all went off to be things like couturiers and work in Paris and Milan. And I didn't come from a background that was the same as them, and my talent levels were nothing like those talent levels. So I'm not really sure of the sort of art and science behind how I got into Kingston University, but I did feel really different when I got there. I felt like I was not like the other people on my course. Right. So it, from that respect as well, geographically it was a culture shock, and just in terms of the culture of the people on the course.
Yeah. Because you probably hadn't met people like that before, had you?
Not really, no. I mean, I'd come from Newcastle College. Again, I'd done a year's foundation there. It was a very safe, cosy environment. I'd loved that. And I felt like I was ready for the next sort of step up, but there was a real difference. And in terms of the people that were teaching us, our professor spent, I think, 3 days a week in Milan as a practitioner, working as for a luxury brand, and then he spent the rest of the time teaching us. So it was straight in with the craft of the profession. Right.
And so it sounds like fairly early on you decided that maybe pure fashion design wasn't really what you wanted to do.
Yes. There was a lot more measuring than I'd realised, and a lot more making than I'd realised. So fashion design, you have to be able to translate something from 2 dimensions to 3. That's part of what you need to be able to do. And
so you can't just get your sketchbook out and draw something nice and go there. Someone else will make it.
Yeah, and I didn't really know that until I got there. So that was a big learning curve. We had to make a lot of stuff over the course of 3 years. So, but in the second year, I transitioned from doing ladies' wear to menswear, because I could see there were only 2 people out of the 30 odd of us in the class. That was back in the days where there were only 30 people in a year on a fashion course. I think there were about 90 or 120 now. So I could tell there were lots of people doing women's wear, lots of people with a similar sort of style and handwriting to me. And I thought maybe if I do menswear, I've got a better chance of getting a job, which absolutely turned out to be true. But whilst I was thinking about that, I also had discovered the wonderful world of trend forecasting, and we'd been trained and taught to understand trends and consumers and how trends are shaped. And that just completely fascinated me. And I knew that given any opportunity to get into that world, that's where I wanted to work.
Right.
But I was told by a careers advisor quite early on, they don't really hire graduates into the world of trend forecasting. You need to really be able to do it.
You should never listen to careers advisors. Well, listen to them and don't always do what they say.
Yes. I mean, they weren't wrong, but it wasn't a case that I should shelve that as a career option for life. It was just that they were never going to hire a graduate, so I needed to go and get some experience under my belt first, which is exactly what happened.
And the sort of trend forecasting that you were learning about then, it was pretty sophisticated in terms of similar to how you operate now.
It was fashion trend forecasting, and at that time, so you're talking sort of 90s, it was all about whatever comes down the catwalk gets translated and you will see that in high street stores in a year's time. And of course, we all know what happened to that. It ended up being a 6-week fast fashion cycle. It's completely changed as a process now. And because we forecast trends now for home, it is different to fashion. And there are different things that will lead people to make a purchase for their home that are wildly different to the things that you choose to put on your body. There are different considerations. So I think it's really different. Right. It's a different game altogether. Right. It used to be, you know, if you can produce a mood board with pictures of catwalk images on it and you can cluster certain silhouettes together that look the same or certain colours that look the same, then you know what the trends are for the next year. Right. It does not work like that anymore.
Well, that's when you first found out that it was a thing that you could do.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was kind of almost like a light bulb moment.
It was, yeah. I loved the research. I loved thinking about what customers would do next. I loved making mood boards. I loved doing colour palettes. And that's what I thought the job entailed. And to some degree, that's what it was in some aspects. But it combines art and science.
I was going to say, it's almost like, it does seem like a combination of the two. They're very creative, but they're very analytical. Yeah,
definitely analytical. There's a sort of science to it as well. You get to look at market research. You also have to use different methodologies for being able to sort of scenario plan different methods into the future. So it's really broad and varied as a discipline, but I didn't realise that at the time. I just knew that I was compelled to work in that industry, and everything I've ever learned about it I've loved. So it wasn't like when I first went into fashion and thought, oh, I'm not good at making things or measuring, I'm not sure I've got what it takes to be a designer. Everything I've subsequently learned about trend forecasting has just made me more interested in it.
Right. And it meant you could put the sewing machine back in a box.
Yes. Yeah. I still have a sewing machine. I just try not to use it.
So that was a 3-year degree in fashion design.
Yeah.
And then so this next photograph was this the earliest? Now this does look pretty glamorous. Is that the New York skyline we can see there?
That's the New York skyline. That was the view from my very unglamorous hostel window. I lived in a women's hostel. So when I graduated from Kingston University, in fact, the Easter holidays before I graduated, I used my grant in the days when you used to get a grant from the government to study. I used my grant and I booked myself flights. My friend and I booked flights out to New York, and we slept on the floor of some graduates from Kingston who'd left the year before us and had got jobs in New York. And we kind of crashed their tiny apartment in, I think it was the hottest summer on record with no aircon. So talk about another culture shock. This was another culture shock. And so we went out there in the Easter holidays. We went to visit a recruitment agent who typically would have come to Kingston to see us and would have picked the cream of the crop to place in jobs in New York. And we decided, well, why would we wait to be kind of maybe halfway down the list or maybe towards the end of the list when we can go and see her and put ourselves at the front of the line? And so we did, and we went to see her on day one. And I think by lunchtime on day one, we'd both been for interviews and both been offered jobs with the same company. And I got offered menswear design assistant, and my friend got offered women's wear design assistant. So we had to phone home from a call box and phone my dad and my mum and dad and say, guess what? And they thought we were going to say, we've landed, we've arrived. And we said, we've got jobs. So that was really exciting. And it just meant we had to come back to the UK, finish our degrees. And then we flew out in, I think, the July. After we didn't even go to our graduation. We went straight out and started working. And so, got a job as a menswear assistant with a company called American Eagle Outfitters, which was a tiny company when I got the job. But actually, the first year that I was there, it grew 300%. It just was on such a growth trajectory. It was unbelievable. So it was fascinating to be in a high growth business at that time. And yeah, that picture is from the ladies' hostel that I lived in, which is where it's called the Webster Apartments. And most women, especially in fashion design, that leave the UK to go and work in New York, find themselves in the Webster Apartments.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's got a huge waiting list, but it's got a high turnover of people, and it's a place for women, professional women to live, and to have a safe base to live when you start out. So it was a really cool place to connect with other people, and I just met people from all over the world, and it was.
So it was like the London thing, only massively
it was,
amplified.
yeah. So a really exciting time, and just being sort of, I think 23 I was, and suddenly living in New York City and being a fashion designer, it was just the most exciting time.
So talk us through a typical day as a New York, because we all want to know what do you actually do?
It was crazy. I mean, even just, the fact that I'd, again, never been to New York until the time that I went there and got an interview and got a job. That was my only experience of having been there. I think we were there 4 or 5 days. So to sort of move there and live there just felt like you were on a movie set, because my only experience of having seen New York would have been in films. So it was very much, we got up in the morning, we had breakfast at the hostel, we went and got our litre of coffee or whatever people get, and you walk to work and everybody's walking in the same direction to work, and got in an elevator that took you up 35 floors to your design studio. Set up for the day, to get my brief at the start of the day from the designers that I was supporting. And it was like digital technology was just starting to come in. I remember I got my first email address in that job. Right. And it was like, wow, this is so modern.
This will never catch up.
Yeah. Who am I going to send emails to? And I'm waiting for an email to come through. It was dead exciting to get your first email. And actually even the art of fashion design was still hand drawn. We were using felt tips to colour in. We were using glue to glue images to boards. Really? So it was still very, very the traditional art of fashion design. And probably in that first year when I was there, when it grew 300%, we stopped sitting around a circular table together and colouring in with pens, and we all got individual booths and computer screens each. And you could see in that year, not just the company grow, but the whole landscape of what it meant to be a designer changed in that year. And it never ever went back to, I only got that little taste of what it had been like previously.
And was that entirely a positive change? Because it sounds like there are some elements of those early days that were really good, and you kind of
I did, because I think if you think back to my sort of link to cut and stick and my sort of collage of being a little kid, that was quite similar to the job that I ended up doing. But as soon as you turn that into a digital activity, it very much changed what the job was about. So it probably was just, if I'm honest, just another sort of tick on the list as to looking for another avenue within the fashion industry. It wasn't the be all and end all, but it was so much of the job was liaising with factories and all things that fashion designers do. It's a really broad and varied role, but it didn't interest me as much as the front end of the process, which was, who is our customer? What are they going to do next? Why are they buying this versus that? And at that time in New York, there was, Abercrombie and Fitch was massive. They were growing faster and bigger than we were, and we were sort of on their coattails at the time. And there was a big thing for vintage clothing, so I would get sent out to vintage fairs to buy vintage leather jackets, vintage t-shirts, vintage shorts, anything that I thought was going to be something we could replicate and design a version of that would be popular. So I loved that bit of it. I loved the trend forecasting, the thinking about what do we do next, feeding the designers the inspiration to do something next with. So I knew that had to be my next step, really.
Because I guess with a brand like, because American Eagle, I've come across them. They're a bit like Gap, only a bit cooler.
Yes.
Is that?
Yeah, and a bit younger. Probably sort of 15, 16-year-old customer.
So was there a kind of a common understanding of this is the kind of thing we do, and we don't do that, we do this?
Yeah.
And was that kind of all sort of written down in a manual, or was it just you got to feel for it? Or?
It was. They grew so quickly that it couldn't have been that organised. But it was definitely the case of, if like you even need to dress the part. I remember my designer taking me to one side and saying, you can't kind of turn up looking like this English girl anymore. You're going to need to embrace like the American sort of college kid aesthetic to fit in here. And I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
I'd never come across that either. It was always, you know, at art school and fashion, you know, in a fashion degree, it's wear something that you feel reflects you. And all of a sudden I was being asked to sort of, for the first time, comply with a company culture.
So it reflects the brand.
Yeah. So that was really interesting to start.
Is that an American thing, do you think? As opposed to what would be in this
I'm not sure. I think it was probably just, I think people were trying to look out for me and make sure that I looked like I fitted in. And being English in the first place, we had a lot of mostly an American design team. And there were really only 2 or 3, I think there were 4 of us maybe that were English. So I think they were kind of looking out for us to make sure that we weren't, not singled out, but just that we blended.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was quite interesting. But yeah, I think the company grew so quickly in that time. I mean, it was surprisingly organised, but it wasn't quite organised enough to say this is what we're about. I was part of a recruitment drive that was just like, we need more people in at a junior level who know what they're doing, who've got a really good design training and a background that can come in and hit the ground running. Because it was very fast paced, dead exciting, really exciting.
So would you be charged with like designing a t-shirt or a pair of jeans and you would just go off and do it, or were you working with other people who were doing
I was assisting the people that did that. However, I was very irritating and would design my own stuff all the time and put it in front of them. And I used to stay till 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, most nights, doing extra stuff. I just wanted more and more and more. It was there was never enough work for me to get through. I loved it. I wanted to be involved. I wanted more. I wanted to progress. I was very ambitious. I didn't really see any reason why it wouldn't be me designing the t-shirts. There were very good reasons why it wasn't me designing the t-shirts, but I couldn't pay attention to that. I was ready to move to the next level. And I think they were trying to teach me to learn my craft and just be a junior and just assist people. But I wanted more. And in the end, that ended up being my sort of unraveling with New York and my reason to move back to the UK, because I just felt like I wanted to move at a faster pace than I was able to there. I don't think it was anything to do with that business. I think it was all to do with my desire to work at pace. But yeah, I think I stayed in that job like 18 months, 2 years, that first job, and I wanted to move on and move on.
Because for a lot of people in that position, that was a dream job in a dream location.
Yeah.
And yet after 2 years, no, I've moved on from that.
Yeah. I mean, I could easily, if I'd been offered a job and a visa with another company, it's not as easy to do as that. You know, once you get a visa, it's with that company. But if I'd wanted to, I probably could have found a way to stay and work for another company. But I had really good contacts back in London, and my old course lecturer at Kingston University had since left and was design director at Topman, and he'd always said, when you come back, I want to be the first phone call that you make. And so I took him at his word, and he maybe didn't really mean it like that. He maybe said, I'll try my best for you, but I thought he would just magic up a job out of thin air for me. And actually, he magicked up a graduate internship that was, I think, a quarter of the salary that I'd been on in New York, and said, why don't you come and do this for a year? If you're here and you're in the building, people will see you and you'll move up quickly. So I did that. And that ended up being a brilliant move. I think I got a promotion within 3 months, way beyond my pay scale at that point. I ended up going from a sort of graduate position, bypassing the level that I'd been at American Eagle, and coming in at sort of a senior designer level. So that was when I got the challenge that I was looking for. You know, that's when I realised, I'm going to have to really step it up here and learn very quickly how to do this job.
But that's what you wanted.
That's what I wanted. Yeah. It suited me much better, actually.
Yeah. So that's a lot to do in a couple of years.
Yeah. And even then I got very, bored quickly. I think it's that sort of entrepreneurial streak that people often talk about that couldn't sort of satisfy that itch, and I couldn't quite pinpoint. And I knew that I was still a fashion designer when I worked for Topman. I really, really wanted to get into trend forecasting, but there were just very few and far between jobs coming up, and they were really rare. I think at the time there were about 200 jobs in trend forecasting worldwide. And everybody wanted to get into that sector. So it was very, very difficult.
Because Topman, I can vaguely remember Topman in the 90s. I was probably too old for Topman in the 90s, but Topman in the 90s was the place to shop, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, it went through a bit of a transition. It went from being the place to be, as did Topshop. And then Topshop actually rocketed and became, I mean, they had their own catwalk collections and all sorts. It became a really big deal. And Topman started to tail off. So we got to see the highs and the lows of, you know, a large retailer, which was very eye-opening. So again, I'm grateful for having that experience there, because we got to see both sides of being in a high-growth company and then being in a retailer where then they're not able to perform. It's a very, very useful experience.
So when you were there, did you still have your eye on this trend forecasting thing that was? Had you kind of decided that, yeah, that's for me?
I was still doing it, even though that wasn't my job title. It wasn't in my job spec. I mean, I left American Eagle. I left the States with 2 portfolios. One which was my fashion design job, which I'd been paid to do, and one which was a trend forecasting portfolio that I had created by myself between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. every night. So I'd come back with a kind of a trend forecaster's portfolio, and then I did this and that's what got me the job at Topman. They said, we can see that you can design and that you can trend forecast. And I did the exact same thing at Topman. I made a nuisance of myself. I said actively and openly that I wanted to work in trend forecasting. Could I take responsibility for the trend forecasting there? And I think I just ground people down with my enthusiasm for it. And they just said, yeah, fine, just do it. So I ended up building a bit of an expertise there. It was completely self-taught, but I was able to build a portfolio so that eventually when a job did come along as a trend forecaster and I went for that job, I did get it because I had a portfolio of work that I could demonstrate.
You've done the groundwork.
Yeah.
Because there isn't a degree in trend forecasting.
I think there is now. You can do one at the Polymoda School of Fashion in Milan.
Right.
There might be another one, but yeah, you can actually study it now.
Right.
But you couldn't then.
So really, anyone who is or describes themselves as a trend forecaster is kind of self-taught, really. And
a lot of people are. I mean, yeah, there's a whole debate around, you know, the difference between trend forecasters and futurists. There's a big industry. It's very complex and nuanced, I would say. But yeah, a lot of trend forecasters are self-taught and they've learned about profiling customers and understanding the future consumer through the hard work of understanding design and how to design and what it feels like. I always remember what it felt like in those Topman meetings, Monday morning, sales meeting. You're all in that room together, maybe 50 or 60 staff. And did your product that you designed, did it crash and burn? Did it sell over the weekend? Did it fly out? Did your buyer buy 10 versions of it just to keep you quiet? Or did they buy 100,000 pieces of it? And it's now, 100,000 pieces on sale in Wigan.
Right.
So we learned at the sharp end of what will sell, what will not sell, what the customer's got an appetite for. And that kind of stuff is gold when it comes to trend forecasting, because you're never tempted to be frivolous with your advice. You know that person has to produce that product and it costs thousands, if not millions of pounds to produce. And they then have to sit in those sales conversations where people say, did it sell or did it not? Did it matter to the customer? Did it not? Did you get the timing right? Are they only going to be interested in it in a year's time and you've gone too early?
Yeah.
So that it's great foundational knowledge for that.
I hate to ask, but did that? Were you ever in that crash and burn situation where you design something and it just didn't?
Yeah, I mean, it does happen when you're a designer. You can never make every call a good one, and it's never just your call either. You're working with a team of people, so you could design a garment, but actually if your buyer decides they do or they don't believe in it, they might heavily invest in sort of the depth of sales behind that product or not. Right. So just designing the product isn't enough to make sure that it gets on the shop floor. And you have merchandising teams as well who decide where it goes. Right. So you could, there were times when we designed things at Topman that were perfect for Oxford Circus, city centre, location, that if you'd put them in the store in Glasgow, which would happen, that would not sell there. Yeah. So even where it was sold and when really mattered.
Right. So that must have been a pretty high pressure, almost cutthroat sort of environment, was it?
Yeah. I mean, I've got really happy memories of being there because I had an amazing team and learned from some incredible people who've all gone off to do amazing things now. So I've got really happy memories of it. And I think I'd learned a lot, but I was still probably in pursuit of this trend forecasting job that I knew that's what I wanted to do.
So you had that position in Topshop, trend forecasting.
Yeah.
But that still wasn't enough.
No, it wasn't. So eventually when I did apply for this job in a small design agency in London and got this job, I think I was there about 3 years in the end, but I travelled the world. I was a trend forecaster at last. It happened. I had a team of people who reported to me. I think I had about 13 people at one stage report to me, freelancers, full-timers. It was a complete baptism of fire, trying to, you know, run and nurture a team in London while I was having to travel to Cape Town and Poland and New York 6 or 8 times a year, you know, to keep the plate spinning of all these different projects was extremely challenging, but I loved it. And I thrived in that role until I didn't thrive in that role. I did burn out in that job because it was so full on.
Right.
And I know that sort of burnout phrase is a very sort of throwaway phrase nowadays. And it can mean different things from what I can gather, but like I can now recognise that was proper burnout. I thought I had flu actually. And my doctor told me it's not flu.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, we had a very similar conversation again with Ian, who had exactly the same experience, working really hard in something he loved, and then just keeling over.
Yeah.
But you don't recognise it at the time, do you?
No.
You think, well, I'm loving this. I'm doing really well, and then it just.
It's such a trick because it's the thing that you enjoy and that you love. And again, like you were saying before, if you're a fashion designer in New York City, what more could you want? You know, yes, all of those things are true, but at the same time, you're working long hours, you're working very hard. You know, I had my own personal ambition that was driving me on probably more than any employer ever drove me, quite honestly. So some of that was self-inflicted, I think. But yeah, it was a real sort of turning point for me in terms of how I knew that I wanted to then go on. And once I had that sort of burnout episode, I knew that I had to leave that job. I knew I couldn't stay in it.
So it was the job. And
it was. Yeah. I couldn't have stayed there any longer. And I think in that particular role, I'd not seen anybody stay in that role for a very long time after sort of maybe 2 or 3 years. It was a very high ask with all the travel, I think, mostly more than anything. And so I wanted to set up as a freelancer at that point. And I thought I had enough under my belt at that point to set up as a trend forecasting freelancer, or if I needed to, I had the fashion design element as well. So that's what I did. And I combined that with moving back to the Northeast. I thought it was time to step out of London. I'd only ever been in London for the job anyway, and it had come to a point where I wanted to move back to the Northeast. So I decided to kind of try and bring my chosen profession back to the Northeast with me, because surprise, there were no trend forecasting companies in the Northeast that I could phone up and get a job from.
I was going to say, I mean, Newcastle isn't Milan, is it? I mean, it's
wonderful.
It's
but
getting
it's not
closer, but then it probably wasn't.
Yeah, I think you know, a lot of my peers at the time said they thought that my network was in London and that the industry was in London, and that I was just going to make it extremely hard for myself to move out of the area and to move back to Newcastle. And that they were right. It was harder, but I have now got a team of 21 people, half of whom are trend forecasters based in the Northeast. And had I not made that decision to move back as a freelancer and then choose to build from one person into 2 and 2 people into 5 and into 10, then we wouldn't have, you know, I classify, yes, we're just one business in the Northeast and we're small, but actually we've created a footprint for an industry that would not exist here were it not for us. Yeah. So I'm massively protective about that. It's like it's a massive deal to me that I had to leave the country and the area to go and pursue a career that I couldn't do here, but now I can provide jobs for graduates that can come out of the local universities, or not from university, you know, maybe from college or even from school, that can see that this is a legitimate career option for them.
In this place?
Yes, yeah.
So that was what, the early 2000s or so, was that?
That would have been 2005 when I moved back to the Northeast.
Right, because it always calls you back, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. I was really happy to move back. So happy to move back. It always felt like home, and I'd never lived in Newcastle before because I'd lived in rural Northumberland in a field. So for me, it was just really appealing to get to spend that time to get to know the city and be in the city. I'd never really had that. So it felt really exciting in that respect. I loved it. And a lot of my friends had either gravitated back to the Northeast or some of them hadn't left. So it was a lovely sort of ready-made friendship and family network to move back to, which eased the pain of trying to set up as a freelancer, which was very challenging.
So there was just you in a little office or
spare bedroom, spare bedroom, yeah. And
where all the best businesses start.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't make enough money to from that alone. I then got a job at what was Cleveland College of Art and Design, which is now the Northern School of Art, teaching there 2 days a week, because I needed to make ends meet. So I taught there 2 days a week, and then the rest of my time, the remaining 5 days of the week, I was trying to find a way to build from freelancer into not necessarily a company, but I wanted to publish my own trend forecasts. And that's what was happening in the industry. People were publishing trend forecasts as a physical product and shipping them out around the world.
Hence TrendBible.
Hence TrendBible, yeah. I wanted to create a TrendBible and ship that out. So yeah, that again, a heavy dose of naivety helped me start to pursue that dream. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for and how difficult that was going to be.
Because I mean, for one person to do that, as well as bringing in work and finding clients, and
it's insane.
You really had no idea what you were doing.
I had no idea at all. And I was pretty sure that I knew I could forecast trends. So that was the easy bit for me. I was pretty sure I could I'd been pulling it into physical documents in my previous job. So I knew that I had some of those sort of publishing skills. I didn't know anything about sales. I didn't know anything about marketing. I didn't know anything about accounts, being solvent. I didn't know any of that stuff. So I had to sort of learn all of the business elements, as well as just, the hardest bit was the sales and marketing, trying to produce something and get it out into the world. The first forecast I produced, I had to get 50 copies printed because the printers wouldn't let me produce any less than that. And they arrived in these boxes in my flat, and I didn't even have room to store them. They lived up the stairs. And I thought, I've spent all this time creating this product and I don't know how to sell it. I don't know what to do with it now. So I did actually sell 2 out of the 50,
right,
which most people I knew saw that as a catastrophic failure. And I saw that as an absolute success because I sold them to JCPenney's and Target in the States.
Well,
so I had 2 really big customers that saw something that was useful. And that was enough for me to proceed.
Yeah, because it's interesting because I suppose when you're starting something, there's only so much you can focus on, isn't there? And,
yes.
And it would have required all of your attention just to get product right.
Yeah, it
so
did.
You probably, I don't think anyone would have the capacity to consider all of those other things as well. So you have to just focus on getting the product right and then almost hope for the best, I suppose.
That's it. I mean, people talk about sort of minimum viable product now, don't they? And a minimum viable product in sort of tech terms, you can do that really quite inexpensively. You don't have to leave your day job to do that sort of stuff nowadays. However, my minimum viable product was, 50 of these physically printed paper manuals, each with maybe 150 pages in them, which I had to physically cut down swatches and samples and colours to stick them in.
Each one?
Each one. So yeah, that was my minimum product, was just getting that to creation was step 1. And the next steps I learned along the way about how to get it in front of people, how to persuade them to buy it, how to sell it, all that stuff, and take on board feedback, and act on that feedback was, a whole different experience.
Right. So you've brought us up to the first ever TrendBible. Should we stop for a cup of tea and then hear about what happened next?
Yeah, good idea.
Great. Welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to make yourself a cup of tea, because that's what we're going to do now.
Thanks.
So as with all of our guests, I asked you what was your favourite biscuit. And this is a biscuit I've never come across. So I had to search high and low in a very large supermarket in Sunderland to find these pickups, pickup original, no less.
Yeah.
So this is going to be my first ever pickup. So I'm hoping it lives up to expectations.
Well, I hope you like it. I think they're quite like a cheap biscuit. I mean, I didn't discover pickups until I was, not that long ago, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago.
Really?
And I've got 3 sisters, and I think when one of us likes something, it spreads like wildfire amongst the other sisters, whether that's a pair of trainers or a bit of food or whatever it might be. And one of my sisters started buying these, and we went to her house and had them. And I think ever since,
And life has never been the same.
The Feeley sisters biscuit of choice. So I hope you enjoy it.
Because they've got a sort of a 70s look about them, haven't they?
They have,
sort of
really. I think
the
they've
stark
actually,
blue and yellow and very little else.
Yeah, I love packaging. I think they've actually taken it back a step, haven't they? Really, they did. It was
Deliberately
a bit more modern
retro.
than this last time I
Right.
saw one. I think they've purposefully stepped it back in time a little bit.
Right. Well, this is going to be a little bit like that scene in the royal family where there's 5 minutes of the various members of the family eating a club biscuit. But that's what the viewers want.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
so don't worry
everyone's going
about.
to go out and buy pickups now, I think.
Well, hopefully we'll get a few boxes sent for the free advertising. Hey, they are really good, aren't they?
Good crunch.
Good crunch, but nice and chocolatey. It's almost like a bar of chocolate sandwiched between 2 biscuits.
That is exactly it. You don't have to compromise between, do I want chocolate or a biscuit?
You can have
like
both.
It's the whole deal.
I am a convert.
They're very crumbly though, is the only thing. So you find that you be wearing the crumbs for hours.
Wow, that's a revelation. Right, so now you've got your mouthful of biscuit, I'm going to ask you something really important. No. So, where did we get to? So you've longed to be a trend forecaster, even possibly before you knew what one was. And you've gone through living the dream in New York, and then living the dream in London, and then it kind of not really being a dream towards the end. And you've set up shop or bedroom in Newcastle as you, really.
Yeah.
With 50 huge, because I'd imagine that they're pretty big, these TrendBible books.
Yeah, they're sort of like a square, sort of A3 size, or they were.
Right, with 100 pages that you've hand stuck things.
Yeah, stuck things in, glued things to, yeah.
But you did get, as you said, you got 2 pretty good customers for us. So how did they find out, or how did you introduce yourself to them?
I went on a trade mission with UK Trade and Investment.
Right.
It's called the DIT now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Department of International Trade. So they host sort of regular missions from the Northeast to help business people, establish business overseas. And I got in touch with them as part of my aim to grow the business. Once I realised what I didn't know, I then could make some good connections to fill the gaps. And they said, we're going to do a trade mission to New York, which obviously I knew very well. And I knew I needed to have a bit of a foothold in New York. And I knew there were sort of 3 or 4 really good sales and marketing agents that just sell trend forecasting publications there. So there was a big trade show. Lots of people from the design industry were going to be there. And I knew that if I could get there, I would be able to go to the show for a day really and speak to somebody from each of those agencies and see if they would represent me and if they would sell my trend books and take a commission. So I went to that trade show. I had absolutely awful feedback from all of the agents. They said, a number of different things, that the front cover was too flimsy, the style of it was too European, it wouldn't work in the US. All sorts of things. The colour palettes, I hadn't Pantone matched the colours and I would need a special license to do that. All sorts of things that I didn't yet know. Yeah. And I just wrote a big long list of all of these things. And when I came back, I just systematically went about fixing every single thing on that list. But yes, I came back without an agent and was very disappointed. I met somebody who had the best agency, the best sort of publishing agency out there. And they said, no, you're not anywhere near up to scratch for us to sell it in our sort of stable of publishing companies. But years later, they actually did pick up the phone and say to me, "We've just found you online. Like, where have you been hiding? What an amazing company. We'd love to represent you." And I thought, how funny that, they can see such a difference between what I had and what I've now got, that they don't even know I'm the same person.
Yeah.
So I did eventually get the publisher that I wanted in the States, but that was part of that trip. Was I just made a couple of phone calls to the head offices and found the right design teams within Target and JCPenney's and met them. I knew they would be in town because of the trade show, met them for a coffee, physically showed them the book, told them how much it was, and they placed orders. So they were the only two.
Because presumably because it sounds like, that isn't brilliant feedback, but it wasn't so much about the content, was it? It was about the kind of...
I mean, there was a broad range of comments, some of which was about the content as well. Some of it was, the graphic design. There were some areas where I'd put some typography, but then when it had been bound, it sliced through the bind and sliced through the words. And so there were things like that with hindsight, very quickly I could mend those things to make it look more professional.
But those two companies clearly saw that the content...
Yes, they did. They
good.
knew that the trends that I was forecasting were interesting in some ways. That was really what mattered to me, was that I knew my trend forecasting was good enough. It was trying to put it into a format that was going to be saleable. And I learned all of those things for the second time around. I think the second season, because we published them seasonally, spring, summer and autumn, winter. The second season, I sold 33. So I learned so much from doing that first one that I was able to immediately apply it. And I think the second season was something like 56 or something. So it just kept growing from there.
And then it was really about selling a book.
Yes. Yeah, it was about a physical product. And to give you an example, I mean, up until 2019, we, from 2011, which is when I turned from being a sole trader really into a limited company and had employees. Between 2011 and 2019, or 2020, just before the pandemic, it was a big chunk of our business was selling these physical trend forecasts. And even in 2019, we had an Italian agent who would receive the book from us and then do a tour in his car of all of the offices in his area and then hand it over to another Italian agent who would do the middle of Italy and drive it around all of the different places there and take orders there. And he would drive it to somebody in the south of Italy who would do the same there. So one of those products would make an entire tour of Italy, physical tour. And it wasn't until the pandemic. I mean, that sounds like some sort of business activity from the 1930s, doesn't it? Not 2019.
Yeah.
But that was the world we were in, was we physically published a forecast. You can't let it out of your sight because as soon as somebody's seen it, they don't have to buy it. So it's a very difficult thing to sell and to showcase. You give them a quick
glance at it and then...
Yes.
Yeah.
Nobody's allowed to take photographs of it or anything like that. You have to physically protect it. And so the pandemic did us a big favour in a lot of ways because it pushed me to make decisions about the longevity of a product like that in a modern digital world. And we flipped it into, first of all, a digital product. We made it into a PDF because we couldn't physically get the staff in during COVID times to safely make a product. And then we took the government-backed Sybil loan and we used that as sort of seed money to create a trend subscription service. And so we flipped that physical product into something that people now subscribe to 12 months of the year. And they get a lot more than just that.
A book coming out twice a year, they can just tap into it any time.
Yeah. So we've completely shifted the business model, but as I say, we were forced to do so.
Yeah. So for those who are watching this who don't really know very much about what that whole world is, I know you said a little bit at the beginning about what it is, but so just in terms of this TrendBible book that someone who was head of design for a large retailer, for instance, they're flicking through it. What sort of things would they see in that book?
So they would see inspirational imagery. So some of that we create ourselves. In fact, when I left the studio to come meet you today, there was a photo shoot happening and I thought somebody had dropped a plant on the floor because there was soil everywhere and a broken plant pot. So that was actually part of a photo shoot to create an image, because when you're trend forecasting, you can't always find images in the now to reflect the trends that we're talking about that haven't yet happened, that are happening in 2 years' time. So we have to create some of our own imagery. We also ask permission from people to share their imagery. So we do loads of different trade shows, but we cover things like the new designers, graduate show in London, which is the cream of the crop of all of the British universities. So we'll go to shows like that and we'll start to see new talent coming through, new ideas, maybe new materials that are being developed that could replace some of the materials we use in the home at the moment.
Right.
So yeah, we sort of have to source inspirational imagery and photograph different kinds of samples so that a designer can flick through that digital document now. It's not printed anymore, but that they can get a real sense of what the social mood will be, why that's the case, because we have to justify why people's mindset will be different, what the home will look like, how we'll decorate. So people like paint companies, for example, would buy that product and be able to develop an entire paint range or a series of paint ranges for 2 years' time from the colour palettes that are in that book.
Right. And it's much more than just this shade of pink is going to be big. It's very much, as I understand it, very much reflecting how you think or see people, what people will want from the world that they create around them, whether that's the clothes they wear or the interiors they create for themselves.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to know what's going to be going on in 2 years' time and how that will make people feel and what they will then want to have around them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to be able to make a call on things like what will the gas prices be? What will the electricity prices be? How will that impact consumer spending? How will it impact people's emotions? All sorts of things. You know, the stuff that we're all reading in the news every single day that is shaping the way that we live right now in the moment, but will that continue to be important and drive our decisions and our thoughts and our emotions in 2 years' time? That is a call that we have to make. That's what we're expected to think about. And because we're a global company as well, we've got customers all over the world. So we don't just have the luxury of saying, we think life's going to be like this in the UK, therefore it's going to be like that everywhere. We sell our trend forecasts in the US, we sell them in Northern Europe, we sell them in Australia. We've got clients in Japan, all over the place. So we have to be able to do a forecast that will knit together change irrespective of which geography people are in.
Right.
We do work with companies who want to know what change will be like in their particular geography. So that might be countrywide, but it might even be a very specific region.
Right.
So we can tailor a trend forecast. In fact, it's a lot easier to tailor a trend forecast to a particular geography than it is to remove any nuance that will pull it into a smaller geography, which might not be applicable overseas. So say, for example, if there was things like the type of things that you could look to that you would get information on 2 years ahead might be something like an Olympic Games. So I think it's Paris 2024. Right. So what you will start to see is not just a link between sport and Paris in 2024. You'll start to see cultural, celebrated, historical sort of links to Paris become popular, and to France broadly become popular just because of the Olympic Games.
Right.
Doesn't mean to say that people are going to have, the French flag as a cushion on their sofa. It's not that. It's much more subtle than that.
But there is an element.
But there have been elements of that. I don't know if you remember, but there was a time when things like this, there was a sort of golden pineapple that became this sort of a decorative motif for the home. That was directly linked to the Brazil Olympics, if you can believe that.
Really?
There are absolute links in research between some of the things that became really popular then and links to the geography, the culture, the history, the heritage of Brazil. Right. So yes, we pay attention to things like that, but you can never forecast a trend from a singular catalyst. It's too risky because even though we think the Paris Olympics is going to happen in 2024, as we saw with the pandemic, there is a chance that some of these things may not happen for whatever reason. So when we are forecasting trends, we always triangulate our research to make sure that we've got very clear routes to a trend so that if one thing falls out, the social mood we're predicting is still robust and solid.
Right.
The risk when you forecast from one activity excuse me, is too great for any retailer or brand to take a huge punt on. Yeah. So we have to be mindful that, a really large corporate isn't going to go and do something just because we found one piece of evidence that suggests that's going to happen next.
Because as you said earlier, there could be a lot. They could be investing millions in a particular shape, product, colour, whatever. Yeah. And they need to know it's going to not end up on sale in Wigan this year.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately their job will be at risk at that point. You know, how many bad decisions do you get away with making before you actually have to sort of carry the personal responsibility for that? So part of trend forecasting is, yes, the company needs to make the right decisions, but the individuals inside those companies need to be really sure about the decisions they're making. That's what they get paid for. And they have to have a bank of resources from the trend forecasting industry and do their own research to back up their ideas, so that when the board pull them in and say, why did we do this? That they've got a rationale and a reason behind that.
Yeah. And typically they'd be doing their own trend forecasting themselves, and they might use you to either confirm what they think or challenge it.
Sometimes. So some of the really big companies we work with, you know, the billion-dollar brands, they have insight teams of, you know, up to 20 or 30 people. So almost bigger than we are as a whole company. So they will do some of their own research and pull some of their own findings. But they also respect the profession enough to know that you've got to have ideas and eyes outside of your profession. I think one thing I learned from working inside companies and trend forecasting inside a company is quite quickly people tell you what you should not pay attention to. Or we don't need to worry about that because we're a casual wear designer, so we don't need to look at the menswear, men's formal wear market. We just need to look at casual wear. Or we're a sports company, so we don't really look at clothing that isn't in the world of sports. Then actually you need to be looking way broader than even clothing in the modern age when it comes to trend forecasting. So, you know, if you take a company like IKEA, for example, they have whole teams of people set up to look at the future through different lenses, and that's to inform their strategic positioning, to inform their design, to inform their approach to sustainability. Those really big companies still buy in trend services to get an alternative view.
Yeah, I still, because when you make it sound so simple, not simple, but so you've basically got a team of people who are just hoovering up vast amounts of information, knowledge from everywhere, and then turning it into some kind of idea of what that will mean in a few years' time.
Yeah, and we gather a lot of information. We've got trend scouts all over the world. So in addition to our core team in the UK, we've got trend scouts all over the world who feed information through to us on an app called Slack, which lots of companies use. We use ours in a very particular way. We use it as a trend scouting tool. So people can put bits of information, news articles, photographs. They might be in the supermarket and recognize that somebody's picked up some pickup biscuits and they've never seen this before. Is it a new trend? So you can kind of draw the team's eye to something that you're curious about or something that's different. We're looking to observe those attitudinal shifts that happen before someone's behaviours have changed, because we all change our attitudes before our behaviours change. We decide we're going to do something before we actually do it.
Right.
So we are looking for those signals, examples of attitudinal shifts.
Before anyone else spots them.
Yeah. And so Slack is a great tool for us. It pings all day long. If my phone was switched on now, it would be pinging all day long with bits of information that are coming in from all over the world. We call those weak signals. And from the weak signals, my team's job is to cluster those into themes and find meaning from them. So we can't just say we found this information, here you go. We have to find the meaning. What does it mean? What do we think is happening that's different? What does it mean between now and 2 years' time? What's the projection and the forecast? And the sort of clustering of the information is a really critical stage. So gathering it is kind of the easy bit, to be honest. Clustering it, sense making, and turning it into a forecast is where the hard work is, really.
Right. And you mentioned that with the pandemic that we've just lived through, had a big impact in terms of how you do business. But in terms of what that did to people and how they feel about the world, must have been a huge thing for you and your team to kind of make sense of and try to figure out what does this mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of hoping it was once in a lifetime opportunity, but we never do know, do we? But aside from clearly the tragedy of a lot of it, there was obviously a lot of terrible things that happened through that period, but it was a genuinely interesting time to be a trend forecaster, to see, globally this sort of the rug pulled out of all of the sort of normality that we'd known. And to see the debate that happened amongst trend forecasters was fascinating, because we had the schools of thought that everything's changed for good, we're never going to go back to the pre-pandemic life, versus people who thought this is an elastic response, we'll sort of ping back into the life that we had before. And of course, a mixture of things have happened. There are some things we've gone straight back into as we were pre-pandemic, and other things that have stuck around. So it was a fascinating time. And I think probably the scariest bit was sort of probably back end of March 2020, when we were just realizing this wasn't everybody go home for 2 weeks kind of situation. And we realized we just put about 6 forecasts into 6 large global brands over the previous 6-month period. And we knew that we were going to have to go back and look at those and check whether they were valid. So that was a really eye-opening experience. And that is exactly why we can never forecast from one catalyst, even if that catalyst is as massive as a pandemic, because those forecasts did stand up.
Really?
And even the ones we'd done in 2018 for 2020, clearly they didn't say, guys, we're going to have a pandemic. But we talked a lot about the home being the centre of people's lives, and how it was already, that trend was already happening.
Right.
So yes, we were all kind of flung back into, a lot of people were flung back into their homes. There was a huge percentage of society that still needed to go out and, do their jobs outside of the home. But office workers had more time at home. So yeah, it was really interesting to go back and see what we'd written in 2018 and how we'd formulated our trend forecasts, and see those stack up and still be relevant in 2020. It's really very, very interesting exercise.
Despite a global
yeah,
catastrophe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a bit of an eye-opener.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because it also, I mean, it changed, I think, in terms of, so you have a team of 23?
22.
22. Who, it does sound like, have the best job in the world. If you're the sort of person who is kind of curious and looking at what's going on and making sense of it, they must love what they do.
It's a really cool job.
Yeah.
I mean, I am probably very biased, but I think they would tell you the same thing. They get to travel the world. They get to go to trade shows all over the world. They get to think about what comes next. They get to be part of the story, not just of our little business, but of what happens inside really massive corporations. Some of the biggest brands we work with are asking us to help them forecast the future of inclusivity and diversity. And so actually, if you think about the impact you can have when you're forecasting trends at scale for really large corporates, yes, we're really tiny, but the impact and the imprint we can make is massive. And I think, again, if you spoke to anybody in my business, they've got a real sort of ethical heartbeat to everything that they do. It sort of threads through every piece of work. Is we all know we don't want to be, none of us went to art school to kind of be responsible for designers putting more stuff into landfill. Yeah. And I think that might not be the case with the whole of our industry, but certainly in our business, we can afford to have a sort of ethical approach to that, and we are aware of our role in the broader sort of consumption story. And my team are extremely passionate about that. That's one of the main reasons I think they come to work for us, is they know that there's going to be a space to open up interesting conversations and do really interesting research that genuinely makes the world a better place. That's what we think we're trying to achieve as trend forecasters, is to make the world a better place.
And it doesn't get much better than that, does it, in terms of a purpose?
It really doesn't. When I think back to the start of my career, I missed a little bit of the story where I worked for Tesco. When I first set up as a freelancer, I was also freelancing for Tesco for quite a long time as head of trends there. And, when I think back to what kind of world we were living in there around about 2005, we didn't have, I think we had one organic cotton t-shirt in the collection at Tesco then. That was it. Nobody was having a broader conversation at mass market, supermarket level about consumption, about disposability, about recycling, sustainability.
Just sell as much as you can, wasn't it?
That's why those people pick up the phone to speak to us, come and help us with these challenges. Right. So the world's a completely different place now.
Yeah. And when you said, you mentioned about, in terms of the team, that's why they come to work for you, but of course, they don't all now come to Newcastle to work for you. And I guess that's another huge change that many of us have seen in terms of our teams and how they're located. So presumably prior to that, everyone was in this office in Newcastle and had their own space, and that was it, wasn't it? I think it was the same for lots of us, but that's all gone out the window now.
Yeah, that's it. We used to really struggle with recruitment because we had to, first of all, do the job of the tourist board to attract people to the Northeast and tell
It
them
is a
why
lovely
they would.
place, honest. It's got how many art galleries?
2.
2.
Yeah, so we were encouraging people to move from Vienna and San Francisco and all over the place, London, to come and move to the Northeast, because otherwise we couldn't offer, we wouldn't offer them a job if they weren't based in the Northeast. It was just part of how we operated, parts of how lots of companies operated. And it took the pandemic to make us realise, we can actually work really successfully and well remotely from home. We did so well working together through the pandemic, and we actually strengthened our culture. It worked really, really well. So it meant that when we were recruiting, we didn't have our hands tied anymore. We could hire people that didn't have to be based in Newcastle. So it brings a different set of challenges. And we do things like we have 4 connection events a year, which are sort of between 2 and 3 days long, when we get the whole UK team to Newcastle and we do something together as a team. So that time is not for meetings, it's not for work. We sometimes do a little bit of training, but we did some wellbeing workshops. It wasn't anything, it wasn't like leadership training or anything like that. We do something that benefits the community. So we did a litter pick. And again, that kind of ethical strand that people like to have part of that. It's part of our sort of celebration of who we are as a business, I guess. And then we do the usual stuff. We go to the pub, we have dinner, we, at Christmas time we have a quiz and do all sorts of other things. So those connection days are they're like reservoir events. That's to top us back up, to make sure that we've got a really good connection with each other, so that the rest of the year, when you have those tricky conversations or something's gone wrong, you can pull down on those experiences and say, I don't know that person super well, but we had a good conversation. I'm pretty sure I can ask them to help me resolve this problem. So that works really, really well.
Yeah, we found that because within RTC we had and still do have an office that could probably have and would have had 50 or 60 people in it. I do now wonder how we got any work done with all that just noise, sound, but we did. And now we work perfectly well with many of us not there at all. But I think we do a similar thing. A couple of times a year we all get together, and it's not to do work, it's just to make those connections. And they do last. They get you through a few months, don't they?
Yeah,
of
really
having
do.
that relationship, and then you might need to top it up.
Yeah, I think it works so well. And it's not to disregard the fact that there are times where we've got particularly sort of our graduates. We do a paid graduate internship, and we've got apprentices who are new to the world of work. So we don't kind of underestimate the importance of them being in an office around other people. So we handle that in a very particular way as well. We sort of say that the Northeast team has to be in at least 1 day a week, which is very low by a lot of company standards. People tend to come in more than that, but we tell them it's 1 day a week minimum. And that means that it enables us to continue to build a workforce and in the Northeast, because that I'm really conscious that it's brilliant that we can hire people from all over the UK, but actually if we've only got an office here and no footprint and no sort of legacy of creating jobs here, that's not quite married up to my goal in the first place, which was to create a sort of hotspot in the Northeast for trend forecasting. And I'll end up having made no impact at all if I had to leave the region to be a trend forecaster, if people could still have to do that to get the experience. So I'm really keen that we continue to have an office and a base in Newcastle, so that we can hire, especially at a junior level, more people from the Northeast to come into the industry.
And I think at that level they do need that kind of foundation, I think, don't they, of being around people and learning just how things work. And
and a lot of them are in a situation where they don't have a home office. They may be in shared accommodation. They may be living at home with parents, so they're in their sort of bedroom all day long. So actually their sort of home isn't as conducive to work as other team members might be. So it's really nice for them to have a place of work that feels like a different atmosphere.
Now, I think it would be remiss of me to not, on behalf of the viewers, since we have a global trend forecaster with us today, come on, give us some tips so where are we now? We're coming to the end of 2023. You would typically look a year or two?
I mean, anywhere
ahead?
between 2 and 5 years ahead, really. And like this, I always say this is the hardest question for me to answer, because at any given time there are thousands of trends that might be applicable depending on whether if you're making a kid's toy, or you are, I don't know, in British manufacturing, you might look at different trends. That's kind of the whole point, is that when you're trend forecasting, you're not trying to get everybody to do the same thing. You're trying to get them to understand what kind of world we're going to be living in so that they can maximize their own opportunity regardless of what it is that they're doing. So I think that's one of the big myths of trend forecasting, is that there's going to be like one color or one thing that everyone's going to do. It's kind of like it's not what we're about as a company, because we need companies to create their own opportunity. And there is such a thing as jumping on the trend bandwagon when it's not right for you at all. You know, if you're a value retailer that can't manufacture luxury fabrics and you're importing everything from China, you should not be following a trend that's a luxury trend, because you're never going to be able to execute it. It's just not going to be your thing. So that's my sort of piece of advice, is always be mindful of what the trends are and think about whether they're relevant and applicable to you. Having said that, there are definitely, particularly in this country, sort of undercurrents of things that are influencing the way that people are behaving. We talk a lot at the minute about this idea of this perma-crisis mentality. Doesn't mean that is a perma-crisis, like a permanent repetition of crises, but people feel like that. And sometimes what people feel is a reality. And as I said before, we're looking for attitudinal shifts. We're looking for things that trigger people's emotions. And, you know, we're hearing a lot of things about people. I heard this phrase the other day about somebody saying they'd been, what was the phrase? Something like they'd been on a sort of like news free almost for 12 months, as if it was like they'd sort of relinquished this. It was like they'd stepped away from an addiction.
Right.
And I thought, how interesting that someone's saying they've been news free for 12 months. In the same way that you might say you'd been alcohol free or you'd stopped smoking. So we're starting to see people distance themselves from or put a bit of distance between this constant news culture of global information that comes to our doorstep in our inbox and our screens every single day. So I think that is something to watch out for. I wonder how much we've had a decade and a bit of people being very actively involved in things like politics. Will people start to step back a little bit more from that if they're actually really switched off by the stress of it and the anxiety that some of it causes?
And I think certainly during the pandemic, it was just wall to wall, awful things, wasn't it? And you couldn't blame anyone. And I'm sure many of us did just, I'm not going to watch the news because it's just all awful stuff. And it's almost an extension of that, I guess.
It is. There's a news culture, I think, that has sort of transpired from that, which is it was happening before that as well, but the bigger the drama, the more terrible and dire the circumstances, then the more newsworthy, you know, it does catch your attention. But actually, if that's all we're consuming, it does have a really big impact on, you know, it has an impact on the way people want to be at home. You know, how do you want to feel when you're at home? Do you want to be comfortable and secure and calm? And in which case, what kind of entertainment are you going to engage in order that you maintain that level of emotional stability? You're not going to put the news on if that's the case. So trends end up being, you know, they cut right through your life, from the entertainment that you choose, the food choices you make, how you decorate your home, who you invite into it, how you form the friendships, how you cohabit with other people. All of those things come under scrutiny, and they're shaped by all of the many things that happen in the world.
Which is all very well, but I was kind of hoping you might tell me, you know, thinking about Christmas 24, what colour should I be wearing to be right with it? But am I going to get that?
Well, actually, we've just been talking about Christmas 23, which, you know, is coming right up, isn't it? And everybody's sort of trying to think about what they might buy and what gifts they might shop for. And again, just to demonstrate how some of those big trends filter through, we're seeing things like alternative Christmases, where some people in the pandemic who couldn't meet with family realized there's a whole other kind of Christmas you can have. If you don't go for the traditional route of being with your family, you can maybe be with friends, you can be with different groups of people. And so we've had this big thing about, what about having pizza on Christmas Day? What about non-alcoholic cocktails? There's lots of people wanting to approach Christmas with a different sort of mindset, a different approach. It's not just about celebration and being together, but actually the motivators and the drivers can be quite different. So that's getting very interesting.
I suppose we had to question everything, haven't we, over the last few years?
Yes.
Why do we do this? Why
Yes.
do we do that? And so now I think that's almost just carried on, that we're still questioning.
I think we're
why do
living
we
in a
do things
world
that
where
way?
we're just becoming more open to, and we say this, from the UK, that not every country is like this, but we can come at it from a place that we're more open-minded. We're more open-minded about, gender and, disability, neurodiversity. All of these topics have broadened our scope of inclusion to the point that now we're starting to approach something like Christmas. We're going, hang on a second. Is this a religious celebration for me? How do I want to spend the time? If I get a week off at Christmas time, how do I want to spend it? How would I like to feel when I go back to work? Do I want to feel like I've done a load of things that was someone else's tradition that actually don't make me feel happy? So there's a sense of it's that kind of selfie culture thing. Like what's important for me? How do I want Christmas to feel for me? So it's probably a little bit more serious than you were looking for. You're probably asking for what's your party cracker going to be? But there are some, that's kind of the point with trends at the minute, is there's some very serious underlying cultural reasons why people are doing things, not picking crackers because they don't want the plastic to throw away and they don't, from a sustainability perspective, or not celebrating with meat and making sure that it's a vegan celebration. You will start to see so much of that come through this Christmas, and it will build.
And for retailers, for many of whom Christmas is a big deal, that must be a bit scary if they have no idea what people are going to want, say, this year or next year.
Yeah, I mean, again, you've got to stick close to who your audience is. And if you've got an audience that, if you're a turkey farmer, you're not going to suddenly start creating a vegan Christmas for people. So it is about picking the trends that play to your strengths. But it should never be scary if you are very close to who your customer is. You should always know who they are, what they're likely to be drawn to. It just comes back to any company has to get really close to who their customer is. And then it'll be clear as day. I mean, we see it with our clients all the time when we present the trends to them. They'll have a physical reaction when they see the trend that they know their customer is going to love.
Right.
In the old days, before we had a digital product, people used to physically, I've seen people pick up our trend book and hug it when they see a trend that is really relevant for them.
Right.
So it's a physical reaction. Their eyes go wide, they look full of joy, and they scribble loads of notes. And you can tell they know their customers so well that they know that trend is going to be perfect for them. Yeah. And in the same way, they know when a trend isn't right for them as well. Yeah. So any company that knows their customer well should never worry.
Whether you're an engineering company or a high fashion company, it's all about knowing your customers. Isn't it?
It is. It's so, so important.
And finding different ways to get close to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it does sound like I'm going to be on my own for next year in terms of what colour I should be wearing. So I'm sure whatever it is will.
It's important that you show up just as yourself. That's the trend.
That's such a comment. So now, the spotlight's been on you for the last hour or so. We usually finish off by just asking: is there something or someone that you think a spotlight should be shone upon?
My sort of immediate response to that is art teachers. Like I'm gonna get a T-shirt printed saying "Art teachers make the world go round" because I think they make the world go round. I mean, I've come from a creative background, as I've told you about how my sort of journey was nurtured from quite a pivotal early age by art teachers, design teachers. I just think it's so critical, and we live in a society now, particularly in the UK, where arts education it's just disappearing. It's so difficult to be able to study an art subject, certainly more than one art subject at GCSE level. You just haven't got a chance of being able to do that. Even where there are schools that offer things like photography and art, you can't pick them. They're in the same bracket. So we have to be really careful that we sort of celebrate art, not just as an artistic endeavour, but it's the home of critical and creative thinking. And what could be more important in a digital tech world than that kind of critical creative thinking? And that's where you learn it. You learn it in those lessons. So I spend a lot of time with art teachers from loads of different schools in the region, and they bring their school children to visit my office, and I take them off around Newcastle. We go on foot and we walk around maybe 8 or 10 different creative businesses in Newcastle, and we just show them, this is a graphic design company. We show them TrendBible. This is a trend forecasting company. This is a florist. This is a cupcake maker. We just take them around all sorts of different creative businesses and show them what people look like, in those businesses, because quite often they've never seen anybody
Yeah.
that looks like them in the world of work. And just to open their minds to the fact that these careers are here on the doorstep. And I can't do that work without those art teachers thinking that is important.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to engage with schools. I know it's kind of a big thing usually on university agenda is to engage with the business community, but it's quite difficult for schools to engage with the business community. And so my spotlight would be on any company that can make a connection with a school and showcase the jobs they've got available. I think is so worth doing, and let them in. It's not about a careers day at the school. Let them in, let them come and see what it's really, really like. Because as I said at the very start, you have to see it to be it. And I think that's the best way to do it.
And as we said, I think for a lot of young people, their limitations are their own limitations and their parents and teachers' limitations. So the more people you can introduce them to and expose them to, hopefully those limitations will be shifted.
Definitely. And I just think those art teachers they're the ones that are thinking really broadly about what the future of work might look like for people that are creative. And, they don't have the same barriers that maybe teachers of other subjects would have, where the end route of a profession, if you study maths or you study a science, you've got some clearer defined outcomes there. Whereas people studying art can go in a really broad range of topics. And it is about nurturing the type of thinking that you would do, not necessarily being artistic.
Creative thinking. Because I mean, we as a company do a lot of work in the STEM area, which is great, and there is a need for that. But I think the more artistic side is often neglected, and it shouldn't be, because they're equally valuable and important.
Yeah, there's a huge focus on STEM, and I'm sure in 20 years' time we're going to see what that's done to a generation of kids who've chosen that as their option. But we're also going to see the fact that the A has been left out of STEAM, and that we are going to lose a foothold of something. The reason I was able to go to America and get a job in America is because I had a British art school education. It's a prized thing. People come here from all over the world to study our arts courses. And if we don't start to value it and get people through from GCSE and A-level into those universities and studying arts at that level, then we're losing a part of our sort of cultural identity, I think. I feel really strongly about it. It's something we've got to fight really hard to hang on to.
So any businesses out there watching this, you might think you want to make some connections with schools. Don't just limit it to the science teachers and the technology teachers. Think about the art teachers as well. Get them involved, and you probably both learn something.
Definitely.
So it's been a fascinating journey. Fascinating listening to your fascinating journey. Yeah, thank you.
That's my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Do join us again when we'll be shining a spotlight on another inspiring person. Bye-bye now.